All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Nathan Stalvey, Director of the Clark County Historical Association. Welcome to all those who are here, both in person and virtually. We appreciate you coming out tonight. Before I turn things over to our Suzanne McCown Education Coordinator, Alyssa Buselli, I want to also show appreciation for the Barns of Rose Hill for allowing us to be a venue here and being a venue for us to host some of our programs here. We do a lot of other programs with them throughout the year, and as well as with a number of other organizations. I encourage everybody to go to clarkhistory.org to learn a lot more about what we do from a program perspective, the Burrow Morgan Mill, and a reminder that coming up at the end of April is our Art at the Mill show. That opens up April 23rd and runs through May 8th. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa Buselli.
Hi, everybody. As Nathan said, I am the education coordinator for CCHA. Today's talk, we have our Jennifer Parsley, who graduated with her MA in Museum Science at Texas Tech, and has spent her career working in various museums across the country, from Fort Delaware to the Alamo. She currently works as an educator in the Texas Historical Commission. As a public historian, she has developed a passion for stories and histories that are often left out of the narrative, and has given lectures on a variety of topics, from the civil rights in Denison, Texas, to the lived experiences of women in the 19th century, which brings us to our program today, which is the Fabric of America series, which this is part one. There will be an additional two following in September. So basically, she will be discussing how fashion and social culture in the 19th century and how that reflects in fashion and like women's place in society and so forth. So without further ado, I'll introduce Jennifer Parsley. Sorry.
Thank y'all for that warm welcome. I am excited to be in Virginia. There's a lot of actual Virginian connections to Texas history. So I'm actually noticing a lot of names. So welcome. We are going to be discussing fashion and social culture in the 19th century. This is a huge topic. I almost got overwhelmed when I realized what I got into. So what I decided instead is to use this as an introduction to a new way to look at the 19th century and a new way to look at American history. The way I give my talks, I am pretty interactive, so if I ask the in-person audience a question, feel free to respond. I view my lectures just as much of a conversation and a dialogue as I do a presentation. So with that, let us begin with the most fundamental question. What is fashion? What stories do fashion allow us to uncover? And how do we look for those stories? And I felt the best way to kind of start with this is this wonderful print from the 1820s. Anyone in the audience, is there anything you guys notice? She's very disapproving, the woman off with the bag. What else do we notice?
Someone's wearing a skirt and a blouse as opposed to a dress.
Ah, it's a skirt and a blouse. I actually think that is an apron, because if you look at her waist, you'll actually notice a tie. Now, what I love about this is it is a caricature of a jealous mistress with her servant. And the jealous mistress, who is this old cantankerous woman, is looking very jealously at her very pretty, very high fashion servant. And I feel like this says a lot about fashion. It says a lot about who you are as a person and about identity. But it also pulls out a thread of American history, which is Americans have always loved to be very well dressed. There was a French visitor in the 1830s. His name was Alexander de Tocqueville, and he was utterly scandalized because he would go into towns and he couldn't tell who was rich and who was poor. because servants were dressing just as nicely and just as elaborately as the most wealthy woman in town. And to de Tocqueville, who was from a very stratified French society, this was beyond the mark. This was utterly beyond the pale. And so fashion is just as much of an identity and a statement as to what is going on in the time period as it is fabric. So we begin the 19th century in 1800, building a new nation. Now, I know the United States starts in the American Revolution and all of that, but we're still building. In 1800, we're still trying to find an identity. We're still trying to figure out what we want to do with this new nation. And the first 20 years of the 19th century is this really exploratory time in the United States. Where are we going? Who do we want to be? So I have these 3 examples of dresses from this time period. What are some things you guys notice? What are some common styles, common forms that you notice? The empire waist, the very iconic empire waist. Anything else? The headpiece. Now, we will get to the 1830s, which is my favorite, but the headpieces they do get very elaborate, or they start getting very elaborate. Anything else?
The absence of crinolines and heavy petticoats.
Very good. Very flowing, very relaxed. So when I look at 1820 or 1810s to 1820s fashion, 3 things really stand out to me. The first is their slim cylindrical shape is very what's called neoclassical. And neoclassical defines the time period. But I also look at the fabric. And this fabric is a thin printed mold that is being imported from England. And contrary to the fact of us being isolated, we are very, very much connected with global trade, even with the War of 1812. And the third thing I really think about is that despite fabric's global influence, dressmaking really remains local. The fabric may be global, but the fashion is local. So we're going to take a little bit closer look at all 3 of these things. So neoclassical craze starts actually in Europe. And what is happening is the rise and the beginning of European colonialism. You see this with India and Britain, but you also see this with France and Napoleon. Napoleon invades places like Greece and Egypt, and they start to pull all of these sculptures from Greece, from Rome, from Egypt, into France and into England. And they fall in love with the fashion style. This is actually an Athenian, actually no one quite knows what it is, but it is a really beautiful picture of Athena and her long draping robes. If you notice, the women are trying to replicate this. But this neoclassical craze actually goes deeper than just the clothing. It's permeating almost every conversation that is being had in the United States. And one of those conversations is the role of women. And you see the rise of something called Republican motherhood. The idea that you are raising the future of America. You are the ones who are going to be developing new citizens for the polis, for the country. So I really like these thin lines and the reflection of not only the philosophy, the political debates, but also in the drape of the fabric. But where are they getting this fabric? So between 1800 and 1820, the United States is developing a new economy. And you see this in the huge debate between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton wants this huge industrialized, globalized economy. Thomas Jefferson wants small, he wants this agrarian utopia. And America settles on a weird mixture of both. And textiles are in the center of it, because textiles are one of the most important trade goods coming in and out of the United States. It all starts with the cotton fields. By 1800, tobacco can no longer really be grown. We have exhausted the fields. But there are new technological marvels with cotton, including the cotton gin, that make cotton easier to grow, easier to process. Americans start to set up huge slave plantations in the Deep South. This is incredibly important because does anyone know where the cotton was coming from before this time period?
Egypt.
India. Egypt comes up later, and we will get to Egypt. But it's mostly coming from India. You're mostly having to import it from India. All of a sudden, the United States is growing vast amounts of cotton, and because they're using enslaved labor, labor is cheap, which means you can undercut the global economy. And the United States is starting to become the largest cotton producer in the world. And it is all being sent to the textile mills in England. These are being produced, turned into fabric, and being sent back to the United States to be creating clothing. And so we're creating this grand circular economy that is driving the United States. Textiles, the growth of cotton, it is one of the biggest economic drivers in the United States. But in the 1800s, 1810, or like 1800 to 1820, it is still highly local. There is no way for you to mass produce women's clothing. It's too tricky. They're starting to kind of figure out how to mass produce men's clothing, but men's clothing is all squares. You don't have to worry about all the awkward curves and lumps and bumps that women care about. Men have them, but they don't care about them as much. Well, they do, but not in fashion. So mass producing women's clothing is still a lively local trade. It's one of the biggest economic opportunities that women have. Textile production by the 1800s is almost solely a field for women. So you have everything from the seamstress who makes your clothes to the laundresses who wash it, all within mostly the local community. You have some of those very fancy women who can order dresses in from London, but those are very rare. So does anyone have questions about 1800 to 1820? Any comments? Anything you guys find interesting about the period?
Actually, I have a question. What about the New England weaving mills?
What about the New England weaving mills? That is a very great question. So they are starting. We, in the United States, just don't have the technological development at that time period to make it a huge success. In fact, this is one of the huge arguments that gets us into the War of 1812. Because these new factories are trying to set up in New England, and they're trying to start producing cloth. But Britain can pour in trade goods. So think about today where we complain about how China undercuts because they're just pouring in trade goods. The exact same thing was happening with Britain pouring in trade goods for the United States. So there are debates about protective tariffs. Should we put protective tariffs on imported textiles to help protect that nascent institution? And it's one of the debates that plunges us into the War of 1812. So we're not quite at the mills. That's actually the next period, the 1820s to the 1840s, but they're definitely trying because they know they don't want to spend all their money on British textiles. Okay, so the new nation is now, I like to refer to this as the toddler period. We've gotten our feet, we're starting to walk, but we're still growing. We still have a lot of questions. There's still a lot of debate about what's going to happen to the future of the United States. And this is the 1820s to the 1840s. This is also, I am unapologetic. This is my favorite time period. What do y'all notice about the fashion? It is very elaborate. Yes. My joke with the 1830s is if it's not giving you slight motion sickness, you're not doing it right. Anything else you notice?
How does she keep her balance with that big headdress?
I love this headdress. I picked this out specifically because it's just so massively wild. Just don't go through any low doors. These are actually very, very light because they're wires. They're actually constructed on wires. So it is very, very, very light fabric, and wires are helping mold and hold it up, and a lot of starch. Wires and a lot of starch. But yeah, I have an ode to 1830s hair we'll get to.
And what's with the romantic heroine, the flower girl over there?
I don't know. I've kind of thought about this. Like, where is she going? What is she doing with the letter? I have like a spy novel in my head about her. But what I love about her fashion is really the graceful cut of that sleeve. The 1830s, you see the rise of these huge, massive sleeves. And I like this one almost because it's the opposite of what the 1830s are supposed to be, like the sheer simplicity of it. So during this time period, 3 huge trends pop out to me. And those 3 trends are the exaggerated silhouettes that we've been looking at. They reflect a new romantic era and honestly a changing status of women. There's really a reevaluation of where women are in society. We're going to do an ode to 1830s hair because it's my love. But you're also seeing an explosion. American expansion west is being driven by a booming demand for cotton. And rapid technological change is expanding textiles Americans have access to. So I feel like this picture is the perfect encapsulation of the Romantic period. This has nothing to do with fashion, but it's the age. It's kind of gloomy, distant, pondering. It's a huge kickback from the classical era. So for all the neoclassical, we're all the Greeks and the Romans, and we're talking about federalism, and we're talking about the roles of how we're going to build this new nation. Romanticism and Romantic era kind of take a step back, and they start to idealize things, and they start to really try to create a mythic history that America actually does not have. So a lot of the mythic stories you hear from the United States about like the founding of the United States, they come from this Romantic period because they're trying to give the United States this grandiose background that the new nation just honestly doesn't have yet. But it also reflects into women. As the men step forward, and they step forward into this more historic age, women are almost requested to take a step back. They're starting to be seen as softer. This is when a lot of ideas about women's emotions and about how women are very emotional, sentimental creatures who should be protected. This is when that idea really kind of starts stepping forward. The Republican motherhood, the idea that this woman is her own active citizen, raising a new nation, is kind of stepping back to this sentimental mother who's protective, who is taking care of the home and the hearth. And you really see that reflected in, again, the exaggerated, extravagant fashion. I have worn 1830s gigot sleeves, and you can't work in them. You just sit around and look pretty. Which leads me to the hair. In the 1830s, the bigger the hair, the closer to God. Truly, this is the era. You cannot get too big, too extravagant, too wild. I don't have much to say about it other than just admire. for a minute. But you can see this woman, you can see she also has kind of that wired cap thing going on. So on the East Coast, this is high fashion, but this is also an era of American expansion. We had purchased the Louisiana Purchase in 1807. We honestly didn't quite know what to do with it. The Louisiana Purchase was mostly an accident. We wanted New Orleans, and the King of France was like, hey, do you want all of it? And we were like, sure. But in 1807, there was really no clear idea of what we were going to do with that land. But we had been pushing west. And one of the big drivers pushing the United States west was the expansion of the cotton market. Cotton prices were booming. And with new short-stapled cotton, you could grow it almost anywhere. It was a cheap, fast crop. It didn't take much inventory for you to get started. You could make a lot of money doing it if you got in quick. So Americans are expanding westward. But Americans are not the only ones living in the United States. I really love this portrait here because this is actually a Cherokee couple. And it shows you how even non-Americans, non-Westerns were taking those European fashions and constructing their own identities with them. For the Cherokees, this was very important because they were one of the 5 civilized tribes. So they were one of the tribes living in this belt from Georgia to Louisiana in very, very rich, fertile cotton land, but also there's gold in Georgia. There's a lot of mineral resources all up and down, and settlers from the United States want that. The Cherokee are not going to take it lying down, and one of the ways that they work to keep their land is by creating a culture, or at least an outward culture, that looks open to Western ideals. A lot of women adopt the fashion. They set up a constitution, a written constitution. They set up a written language because they knew that these were signals that the American government were more likely to adhere to. That did not work. The Trail of Tears pushed out them all to Oklahoma, and the Cotton Empire continued to expand. Because by this point in time, England would take as much cotton as the United States could throw at it. Cotton was booming. Because changes in textile manufacturing were opening up whole new worlds. By this point in time, India was completely cut out of the cotton market. It's completely cut out of the fabric market, which is amazing because even 100 years before, India was the only country really producing cotton textiles. By 1830, it's Britain. And Britain is mass producing using marvels like a roller print. And what a roller print does is, prior to the invention of the roller print, if you wanted pattern on your clothes, you had to hand stamp each block carefully to create a whole yardage. This makes yardage very, very, very expensive. Well, now it's on, imagine a rolling pin. And you're able to create the most wild, intense patterns for cheap. And this is one of the reasons why the 1830s get so eye-poppingly gaudy, is because all of a sudden you have access to all these patterns and prints you never had before. So the 1820s to the 1840s is really a time period of growth, of trying to take what we've established and to push it and to grow it and to find new ways of doing things. So does anyone have any questions about the 1820s to the 1840s?
Is this when aniline dyes also became available?
Those are in the 40s and 50s, and we'll actually get to that. But we're trying. We're trying so hard. Unfortunately, at this point in time, we're still stuck with things like indigo. That's why madder. That's why as much as the designs are eye-popping, they're mostly greens, reds, blues. You're not seeing a really wild, extravagant variation in color. So the 1840s to the 1860s, I feel like the best analogy for this is the wild teenage years where we're testing some things out and some of it just doesn't quite work. What do you guys notice for these women? What are some of the fashion trends that pop up to you? Plain, dark. The dropped shoulders. That is actually a very huge indicator. Anything else?
Not everyone is wearing anything on their head.
Yes, we have realized our 1830s mistake, and we've decided to quietly ignore it. It's much like the mullet, although I have noticed the mullet is making a comeback. And this is really kind of mimicking the sober, weird time that the 1840s to 1860s is. Women's public lives become very restrained. In England, Queen Victoria is crowned in 1836, and this is the beginning of the Victorian time period. Now in America, it's not quite the Victorian time period. I actually get really irritated when people are like, it's the Victorian time period. But these ideals do cross the ocean. And these ideals of what a proper middle-class life should be like really begins to constrain roles that women can play in society. The 1840s to the 1860s, you're seeing an explosion in clothing. Clothing the slaves is a big industry. It's big money. It's a whole cycle. And the sewing machine and the crinoline will create a fashion revolution that will impact the rest of 19th century fashion.
Well, I'm surprised there's a lot of variety in fabric patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the minimal amount of looms or whatever is making those patterns.
So this is for the online audience. She asked me about the wide variety of patterns given the minimal amount of looms. That's actually not the case. So pattern design is actually a huge business, and like people will actually print out pattern books. By this point in time, the Industrial Revolution in Britain is in full swing. Where you see the limitations and constraints when it comes to patterns are two things: fashion, like what people will buy, like what their tastes are, and it's the colors. It's how can the colors be applied and what colors are available. Those are the two things that are really just limiting. But because of this, most of the time, the prints you see are florals or dots or stripes. So it's not because they didn't try. But yes, not only is Britain mass producing this stuff, and we're talking, it is millions upon millions of yardages coming out of the looms in Britain. And that's not just in Britain, because by this point in time, the factories, we were talking about the Lowell girls, the mill systems, they're really starting to kick into gear in the United States, and those are also producing large quantities of fabric. Okay, so before we go on to the next slide, this is absolutely one of my favorite dresses I want to show today. And I want you guys to guess why. What is special about this dress? What sets this dress apart from any other dress that I am showing you? You're not allowed to answer. Yes. So have you seen this one?
No, I have not, but I
Oh,
very good business.
ah. Normally it takes quite. I shouldn't do so well citing my sources. All right. So
Question though, is that a woven pattern or is it a print?
that is a print pattern, and we'll get into it. But yes, this is one of the few documented dresses we can to someone who was enslaved, and we'll talk more about this dress. But I didn't want to pop it up on this slide. I didn't want spoilers. But you are too good at reading my subtype. So before we get into that dress, we're going to talk about the cult of domesticity. The cult of domesticity is the culmination of this romantic period, of this idea that women are these fragile, emotional creatures. And so by the 1840s, the idea that a woman's role is in her house was very firmly set. She had no real role in public life. Now, of course, this was the ideal. This was the theory. Now, in practice, did it work like this? Mostly not. But to Americans, the cult of domesticity was the ideal middle class standard. Your role as a woman would be to get married, to run your household, to run your church organizations. You were to have really no public persona. You were to leave that to your husband because your job was to create a hearth and a home while having zero political opinions whatsoever. Now, that didn't happen, but that was the theory. So yes, so about this dress, we think from what I was reading, this dress is held by the National Museum of African American History. We think it was a Sunday dress. We think it was a Sunday best dress. It is printed. It is a printed mole. And what I love about it is that even the enslaved were using fashion to define themselves and to create an identity when they could. This was probably not material provided by their owner. What this probably was is that they worked extra hours, they worked to find extra money, and then they made this dress specifically to go to Sunday worship and to be with their, as much as they could, their family, their friends, to create this identity of being as well dressed as they could. But clothing slaves was a big business, and it was also very circular. So the slaves were growing cotton in the fields. They would send them to the mills. Osnaburg would come back. It's this very, very cheap fabric. They would be administered, it depended on who owned them. And you would only get a certain amount of fabric. But it was huge business. They had entire factories set up to supply slave owners with cloth and cotton for their slaves. But it was also a way to identify people. Every time you read runaway ads, they always talk about the clothing they wear. It's very much tied into their identity, and it is tied into ownership. So that is one of my favorite dresses. But we're also seeing a fashion revolution. This ties together a lot of the questions you've been asking, because a lot of the developments in from the 1800s to the 1840s that we have blasted past, because I only have so much time to tell you, all pulled together in the 1840s to the 1850s. The three big inventions, the first is the sewing machine. It cannot be stressed enough how revolutionary the sewing machine is to fashion, and how much it changes and how much it opens the door to our modern mass-produced clothing.
Was the sewing machine available price-wise to your middle-class woman, or were they for industry?
So both. And actually, this is one of the brilliancies of the sewing machine. And this is something I'll get into a little bit later, but the sewing machine is one of the first things you see. They get smart. So companies realize that the sewing machine on its own is too expensive. So think of this like a $3,000, $4,000 purchase. Like you're like, oh, like it sounds nice, but like I'm not gonna do $3,000, $4,000 purchase. And they're like, no, it's okay. You can do it on monthly installment plans. It'll only be $50 a month. You know, for them, like, you know, $5, $6 a month, you can pay it off. Or, oh, no, it's okay. You can start a clothing circle. So why don't you pool your money with your neighbors and you can buy a sewing machine? So in the 1840s, it was mostly industrial, but the sewing machine is one of the first items, quite honestly, that marketers are looking at women and saying, we have an untapped market. We can sell, and we can sell a lot of them, if only we can figure out how to convince them to pay for it. And so in the 1840s, it's still a very new technology. People are still figuring it out. It's very much a just radical piece. Like one of my favorite stories about the invention of the sewing machine is that one prototype in the 1830s. It's developed by a Frenchman, and he sets up a factory for it. And this is the French tailors in town actually go to his workshop and burn it down because they realize that thing is going to put them out of a job. So he doesn't get the message. He tries to build it a second time. They burn it down a second time. And they actually run him out, and he has to go to England because the people who rely on, like, going back to what we were talking about in 1800 to 1820, this is still a local activity. You have your seamstress, you have your tailors. They're all recognizing the writing on the wall with those. So the second big thing that shows up is sprung steel. And this allows the creation of the crinoline, of the hoop skirt, of the very iconic 1860s fashion that we will see. Prior to this, you were getting to a max point. Women wanted these huge, wide skirts to show off this brilliant new fabric that they had access to, the wealth that was pouring into the United States during this time. They wanted these very large belt skirts to show off the fabric. Well, your fabric can only get so wide before you can't support the weight of it. It's very, very heavy because you're wearing 4, 5, 6 petticoats underneath. You're having to wear things like horsehair. One of my favorite examples that I found was actually rubber. They had rubber hems that they would inflate. I was impressed. I was like, I have serious, deep questions about this, but I don't have time to research more. Otherwise, I would have had pictures. But with sprung steel, which can be molded and shaped, this allows you to get rid of all those layers. It allows you to get rid of all these heavy, heavy, complex underpinnings. But it also allows you to play with structure and form and do all sorts of magical things. So you have the sewing machine, the crinoline, and then you have what we were discussing, aniline dye. It actually was completely accidental. There was this 19-year-old chemist. He was doing some experimentation, and he accidentally invented a new fashion craze. Because this mauve, this purple color, you can't get this in nature. So every woman wanted it. They wanted the cool, new, amazing. And so for a while, there is just a mauve trend. And at least for modern eyes, I'm like, okay, maybe almost as bad as the 1830s hair, but you know, it is new, and it's fancy. But these three trends, the sewing machine, the crinoline, and these fantastic new chemical colors, they are going to create and set the stage for the second half of 19th century fashion. And that is when we get to the 1860s to the 1880s. Now, does anyone have questions about the 1840s to the 60s?
Did women on the frontier wear those clothes?
Yes, yes. Okay, so I can actually say this with quite certainty because I am from Texas. And so Texas was settled roughly 1825 to 1845. And absolutely. Sometimes they struggled because they couldn't get the supplies. But it's really funny when you look at, especially like frontier stores, how quickly they're starting to pull in fabric, how quickly the dress trimmings come in. Like it is, women want to be fashionable because it is a mark of station. It is a mark of respectability. You want to dress as best you can because that's a sign and a symbol of your success. So you actually see women following the fashion as close as they possibly can, if they can afford it and if they have access to it.
I read it was difficult for women to sit in that. I mean, they sat on the edges. They couldn't sit back because of the wideness of their skirt, or they couldn't have armchairs because they needed room for the skirt, the crinoline.
Yes, but it was actually, so I'm a living historian, and so I wear this stuff sometimes. It's a thing. Actually, I was running around this morning in an 1830s corset, and it changes the way you move, but not in an uncomfortable way. Especially if your undergarments are well-fitting. They're just, you get used to it. You know how to move. But it does change the way you move. So a chair you're not going to sit kind of lean back like a lot of you are because it's not the crinoline. It's going to be the corset. You can't do that. You have basically a wooden busk, a wooden or a metal busk going up, and a lot of it is boned. So you're not this and this are not movements you can make. But at the same time, think about today's fashion, where today's fashion is very solely dependent on how you look. And you want to be waist thin. Well, there's no way to achieve a waist thin look. It's just impossible. But during this time period, if you got the right corset, you were looking fashionable and you were looking fly, and you didn't have to lose any weight to do it. The crinolines did cause problems with seats and stuff. There are some beautiful caricatures. I thought about finding them. I thought about putting some in that were making fun of it. But the thing is if women didn't like it, they wouldn't be wearing it. If they weren't fascinated by it, if they didn't feel pretty, this wouldn't be a thing. So some of it was a bit ridiculous, but that's what they chose. That was kind of the fashion choices that they made. But yeah, you definitely have to sit in a whole different way when you're rigged out with your corset and your crinoline. You're not going to sit in a chair the same way. Also, shoes first. Always put on your shoes before anything else. I don't know if you're ever going to use that advice, but shoes first. So with that deep philosophical advice, we're going to move into the 1860s, where war waits for no woman. So the Civil War may be raging on in the men's world, but for women and for fashion, time did not stop. In fact, women's fashion went through some of the most dramatic changes during this time period. And you can see, I tried to find as best as possible. This is in early 1860s. This is about 1869, 1870. And this is about 1880. So what do we notice going on here?
Changing the silhouette.
It is dramatic. But I've always admired the sculpted. The silhouette changes, but it's all just this very sculpted form.
Is there more of a waist?
Yeah.
Is it dropping?
Yeah, you can actually see it here. There's a Princess Anne style that actually goes almost to your hips. Anything else we notice?
The bustle is for the beginnings of a bustle.
We are in the beginning of the bustle. We'll get to like the true bustle butt in a bit, but yes, we are starting to see the beginning of the bustle. So the 1860s to the 1880s, it's a wildly dramatic, transformative time period in the United States. Arguably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, not only cultural, political, economic, really by the end of the 1880s, it's a whole new world. From a fashion standpoint, the two things that I really pick out is that mass production comes into its own. We've been flirting with it, we've been looking at it, we've been thinking about it, but it's the 1860s to the 1880s that they're really working and figuring out how to mass produce clothing. But we're also hand in hand with the rise of consumerism. So we're starting to see modern consumerism, modern advertising, modern changes of fashion in order to create a market. And so the rise of consumerism, actually we're going to talk about mass production first. So what happens when war happens?
Production goes to the war effort.
Not only does production go to the war effort, but it's a very innovative time period. And if you have to clothe thousands upon thousands upon thousands of soldiers, are you going to get good at it? You're going to get very good at it. But you're also going to figure out how to do standard sizing. And standard sizing is one of the biggest, trickiest things, especially with women's clothing. And this is one of the roadblocks to mass production of women's clothing. Prior to the Civil War, they couldn't figure out how to standardize women's clothing. They just couldn't. Men's clothing was kind of standardized. It was like small, medium, and large. And you hoped you had a wife at home to tailor it. That's kind of how men's mass production worked. But in the 1860s, 1870s, there are starting to become systematic methods that are produced that allow small manufacturers to start producing women's clothing on a mass scale. And this is going hand in hand with the rise of mass consumerism. So the Civil War ends, and the United States basically has to build itself up from the ground. And one of the things they invest in is railroads. Railroads are transformative. Can anyone think why a railroad would be such a big issue, such a big deal? It moves things faster, exactly. It moves things faster. It's also more reliable. You can send more. A railroad allows you to send more than you could ever send on a horse and buggy. And shipping, you could send a lot on ships, but ships are limited. Ships can only go where there is water. And there's quite a bit of the United States, if you look at a map, it's not connected to water. And so railroads allow you to all of a sudden ship huge, huge quantities of goods. So you have all of the mass production that the Civil War has been driving. It's much like the end of World War II. Think about the end of World War II. You had all of these factories, all these economic drivers, all of this pent up cash. And the government and the factories are trying to figure out how to keep the money flowing. That's the exact same thing that happens after the Civil War. And so for the first time ever, you really see trade goods just being sent out, fashion changing on almost, seasonal basis. And it hits all levels. This is the companion dress. This is a dress sewn by Ruby Bryant. And this is her freedman dress. So this is As soon as she's emancipated, she creates this dress. And if you look at it, it is as close to the height of fashion as she can manage. But it's because you can go in and you can look at Harper's Bazaar and you can order anything from Chicago, you can order anything from New York. And this is really changing and driving and pushing a lot of these changes. So that was kind of a quick, I'm going to be honest though, 1860s to 1880s is kind of my weak spot. But does anyone have any questions about it? Yes?
So now that there's mass production, obviously there's a demand for more material.
Uh-huh.
How does the impact of the Civil War, when suddenly there's not the labor force that they once had, that was not really as much of a cost issue, how does that impact the mass production of the fashion industry post-Civil War?
Okay, so you're asking how does, since the slaves are free? Okay. This is an excellent question because this brings up Egypt. So what happens is there is a really huge shift and realignment of where cotton is coming from because we're not in a vacuum. So it's supply and demand. So Britain factories no longer are able to get goods, cotton from the United States. So they just go find other places. And so India begins producing cotton again. Egypt begins producing cotton. This is actually the modernization of Egypt happens in 1860s, 1870s because raw cotton is being produced or is starting to be exported to Britain. They're starting to get all of this money and it's pushing modernization. So globally, it doesn't really change anything. Now, what you do see, and I was having an interesting discussion with Melanie today, there are several economic crashes that happen in the 1860s and 1870s, not only in the United States, but globally for several reasons. There's a huge panic in 1873. So what you do see is that while there's mass production of fabric, women don't have the money to buy it. And that is one of the reasons why you see that is 1860. We're flush with cash, everyone has money, we can afford to show it off. This is the 1880. We've had the Civil War, we've had Reconstruction, we've had multiple depressions. The thinner silhouette takes less fabric. You can make up for less fabric with the decorations. So you're seeing, one of the reasons you're seeing such a dramatic change in the fashion is because the pre-war prosperity, you can't afford that. So you start to narrow your skirts, or the narrow skirts become more fashionable because you can't afford it. And it kind of helps drive that change. So I think long story short, or long answer short, it's less on the production side, more on the consumer side, and more on the choices of what consumers are making and how consumers are making those clothing. I hope that was a good answer. So we get to the turn of the century. We get to the 1880s to the 1900s. The modern 20th century is almost near. What are some of the things that we're seeing? The bustle. You really like the bustle. We also have natural form here. And I find that's interesting because we get rid of the bustle for a bit, and then it makes it like a little bit of a comeback, and then we're like, oh, that was a bad idea. Yes, you get the return of the Lego mutton sleeves. I don't know if anyone has read Anne of Green Gables, but when she's crying out for her gigot sleeves, her large sleeves, that's what, yes, her puff sleeves. Hats too. I will say 1890s is a good time for hats. So 1880s to the 1900s, we've gone through the crucible of the Civil War, and we're really facing an entirely new world. And that new world is coming out in a few different things with fashion. You see the new woman. You see a whole new kind of reassessment, reevaluation of what women's roles in society are. But this is really being driven by the working woman. And when it comes to fashion, the rise of ready-wear that we were talking about and the power of women's shopping hits its stride. And this is what's going to push us into 20th century fashion. And this is really what's going to hallmark what we wear today. So there's a huge debate about where women's role in society. We're completely reanalyzing it. I like the World War II because it's nice, relatable, and I work at a World War II site. World War II, you see women going to war. You see women pushed to the challenges and completely reevaluating their place. The same thing happens after the Civil War and Reconstruction. You get things like the suffragettes, women pushing women's rights to vote. What are women's roles in society? We had the whole cult of domesticity for almost 50 years, and women are starting to push back. Women are saying, we want to have more of a role, especially when you think about the 13th Amendment and pushing those civil rights. Women are like, women are asking, why are we not included as well? You're seeing the rise of immigration. On the East Coast, you're seeing a lot of, especially Eastern European, pouring into Ellis Island. These are fueling the sweatshops of New York. On the West Coast, you're seeing actually pretty large Asian immigration into the United States until it was shut down and created illegal. But you're also creating new technologies, and you're creating new outlets, especially for women of leisure. So things like the bicycle and the automobile, they're starting to come into play. And so the 1890s is really the first time you're starting to see sportswear and the specific, very specific casual athleisure wear for women. As especially women who are wealthier. This is the Gilded Age, so we're talking the huge oil tycoons, we're talking the robber barons, as they're playing with fashion. And also starting a little bit of a scandal with their bloomers. But with the rise of all this new technology, all this rapid change, you're also seeing the working woman. So starting in the 1860s, 1870s, women are starting to push into the labor force. Now, they had always been in the labor force, but there hadn't been many roles for them. They had been very constricted and refined. Starting in the 1880s, 1890s, you were seeing whole new industries develop, and these were creating places for women. Things like telephone operators, clerks, women who could type. Ida B. Wells was a reporter. So reporters, women could always write. Professional writing was one of the few professions open, especially to upper class women, but you're starting to see like actual reporters. And this is changing fashion, because if you're working at a telephone operation, are you going to be able to have really wide skirts? No. But are you going to still want to look pretty? Yes. So how do you create fashions that allow the working woman who now has disposable income, who now has money to burn in her pocket, how do you create fashion that she will buy? And this is a question that companies rose up to, because you are starting to see the first retail department stores where women could go in, and retail department stores were specifically designed for women. Women were the key marketing, because cult of domesticity, who was in charge of shopping? Who was in charge of making all those decisions for the home? The woman. So who's going to be going to the department store? Not the guy. I mean, to this day, you tell my dad to go buy a pair of pants, and I think my dad would panic. I don't think my dad knows what his size is. So you're seeing a shift of ready-made clothes. You're seeing what we consider modern fashion, modern shopping. So that was a very quick intro to the 1880s to the 1900s. Do you have any questions about that? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
They wore a lot of that, it looked like white clothing. Washing machines weren't around yet?
So that's an excellent question. So white is actually one of the easiest things to wash. And that's why a lot of your underpinnings will be white, because you can boil them. And so white is basically just bleached out. So you can boil them into submission. You can also use something called bluing. And what that is, I don't know if you've ever had something that's white and then all of a sudden it kind of takes a yellowish tinge. You can put a little bit of bluing in it, and it will actually help, by optical illusion, make things look brighter and whiter. Now that's for your underpinnings. But the underpinnings are critically important because they're not washing their clothes as often as we are. Your outer garments are not intended to be washed after every use. Because you wear all your underpinnings, you wear a shift, you wear petticoats, all of those are picked up. All of those can be boiled and laundered very easily. And then your outer garments are not washed as regularly. What it also is a sign of prestige. So not so much during this time period, like the 1880s, 1890s, but if you can afford to wear something white like this, are you doing your own laundry? Absolutely not. And so especially with outerwear, especially the earlier you get, white is prestige because you're not doing your own laundry. And that's a sign. Like, you are living a life of luxury. You can afford to have someone else do your laundry for you. Whereas if you're wearing something like this, do you think that's very difficult to launder? No. But so that laundry is its own whole separate, this sounds really weird, but I'm a women's historian. I could wax rhapsodically about laundry for days. But at the end of the day, especially white clothing and laundry, it's a symbol of status and class, and how well can you have something maintained, or how well can you get someone else to maintain it?
I have a question about that purple costume with the white piping.
Yes.
Did that, it has not really a train, but it's longer in the back.
The
Have a panel that was removable so that when it got dirty, that panel could be taken off?
that one?
Yeah.
Okay, a lot of times what happens is that underneath it's lined in a heavier, like often like a cotton or something, and that's what can be changed out.
Okay. So when you're dragging it across the floor.
Right. There'll be like a dust cover underneath. Am I correct, Melanie?
Yeah, it's actually called a dust ruffle.
Okay, yeah.
A dust ruffle.
And when you get the later trains, they really, really drag on, it's a whole separate piece. It's just like a U-shaped garment with literal ruffles on the bottom and the top to give you some, and you just launder that. I have a question about the pictures. Where did you source a lot of these dresses from?
All over. When I asked Melanie, because I am from Texas, I asked Melanie if she wanted a more Virginia focus. She told me it could be a more national. So I got them from all over. I tried to make sure that they were American examples, though. I tried to make sure that they were examples that could be dated or. So some of the big ones, the Met has an amazing costume. There is oddly enough, it's in Kyoto. There's a really great. There's also a museum in California, the FIT, I think it's called, for the earlier, the 1800 to the 1820. DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, actually had a marvelous exhibit a few years back called The Agreeable Tyrant, and talking about specifically American fashion from about 1780 to 1820, and I used images from that. So because I just had like full geographic range. Normally I am like condensed to one geographic range. I could just go mad and pick whatever pretty dresses I wanted.
Enslaved dress that you showed.
Yes.
What would be comparable? But all the other dresses were very flamboyant and very elaborate. So am I walking around?
So
I'm a middle class lady. My husband's a farmer, and what am I walking around in my house?
So I did try to include working class images for each of these. So for the 1890, the woman on the right is actually pretty standard middle class. That may be her Sunday best, but that's very middle class.
She's not wearing that during the week. She might go to church in that. So what am I going to wear? What am I wearing during the week?
Well, it depends on what she does for a living. So like if she's living, but here, this one is a great one for it. This is just a street scene. So this is 1890s Marshall. The woman who took this photo is a German photographer, and she was just walking around and snapping these shots. So these are women who are we're talking small town East Texas, and this is what they're wearing. They're just walking around wearing it.
Were they walking around wearing that in their house?
Yeah.
That's what when I go outside of my house,
Oh.
different than what I wear inside my house.
Okay, I'll say, okay. So that is an excellent question. Especially in the early time periods. Hold on, let me get back. So like this, yes, this would be something. This I specifically picked out as a working class. This is in your home. So at-home leisure clothing, especially by the 1860s, becomes its own style. So you have things like this dress called the Mother Hubbard dress. And it frankly held some like scandalous overtones because it was like you wore it because it's like the modern equivalent of yoga pants and a sweatshirt. It's called a Mother Hubbard dress, and it has like a yoke here, and then it's just like a straight panel. And so starting about 1860, women, especially middle class women, could start to afford to differentiate, to have at home and outside clothes. Prior to 1860, middle class and working class women, they didn't. So you may have a Sunday best, but your Sunday best and your regular clothes are going to look very identical. The only thing that may be different from your Sunday best is that it may be like a nice silk or wool as opposed to a washable cotton. Yeah. It seems really crazy to us today, but there are certain adjustments that you have to make. Like Melanie and I are currently making an 1830s work dress for myself. And it's something that I would wear working as a laundress, as someone who is doing heavy manual labor all day. And I can't wear something like, like this over here. This is impractical. I can't work in this. it's too long, the sleeves are too bulky, it's going to get stained the moment I use it. But if it's something like this, where it's darker, it's probably wool, so it'll wear better. The sleeves are still trying to kind of have a fashionable shape, but I can work in them. So you're just gonna adjust, and you're just gonna kind of tone it down, but you're still gonna be wearing the same kind of style.
How do they accommodate pregnancy?
Ooh, good question. So I think I took it out. I'm almost mad at myself. I did. So it depends on the time period. So you're talking Regency, and you're talking those really nice high. You didn't do anything because the waistline is so high. Your stomach would just kind of, and it would just. Now you do see prints. They're satirical, but they are making fun of the fact that like the front of your gown will slowly start to rise because the excess stomach. You will also get for the 1830s. I've actually seen drawstring, where the waistband is actually a drawstring, and you can kind of slowly loosen it over time. After the 1860s, you saw how form-fitted that was. So that's when you kind of start seeing those like Mother Hubbard gowns being used, especially when you're, going through pregnancy. The other big one that's kind of a roaring debate that not many people have answers to is breastfeeding. Like, how do you breastfeed in something like this? A lot of the answer is wet nurse if you're rich enough. If you are rich enough. The other thing is like front closing bodices. I had a really cool 1840s that I took off because I was going in a different direction. But do you see how it kind of has like a paraline over it, like a little shawl thing over it? So it had that more simplistic because it was a more working class dress. But what happened is if you pulled the flaps up, there was actually slits. So you could just pull things out, feed the baby, put everything back in, pull the paraline back over, everything's covered, the baby's fed, you're still looking very fashionable. So,
But did not upper class women still try and corset themselves in?
no.
No?
There were a few, but there are, especially by the 1880s, 1890s, like specific maternity corsets. They're really cool. Like some of them even have like little elastic bands that, and so the thing about corsets is corsets are not bad. Corsets are back support. Most women did not tight lace. That's not something they did. I'm bringing this up a lot, but it's just because I have practical knowledge and experience, and I was doing it this morning. Again, I was wandering around in a corset this morning. I was not tight-laced at all. I was like very comfortably 2 inches from my regular measured waist. And that is an 1830s, that is not waist reduction at all.
Where can I get a corset?
If you talk to me later, I will give you some fabulous examples. But again, if the women didn't find them comforting, if they didn't find them comfortable and didn't think that they were working, they wouldn't have worn them. And so when you look at a lot.
To tailor off of that, there was, I can't remember her name now, but there was a living historian who was pregnant who did, I want to say 1860s, and she blogged about her experience. She wore a maternity corset. And the trick is, we think that it's going to be restricting around the stomach. It's actually tailored to bent on the sides, like I understand with the elastic bits. So as your stomach expands, the front comes out and the support stays in the back. So like a lot of modern women wear the like athletic tape over their stomachs to kind of help. That was the period version of athletic tape.
That's nice.
Yeah.
What do they wear to bed?
So again, depends on the time period because as you get closer and closer to the modern period, going back to the mass production and stuff, you're getting more and more options. In the early 1800s, it was either nothing, or there was a undergarment called a chemise, and it looked like basically like a t-shirt dress. You would just wear a chemise. As you kind of progressed, you were starting to see nightgowns and things like that. So by 1890, women are going to bed in like nightgowns. They also have something called wrappers, which are like the robes that we would wear. Yes?
Well, I don't know if this is the right time in your program to bring it up, but we have brought a skirt
Oh,
that
what?
we would like to show you.
Sure. Sure.
See if you would like to comment on it.
I can totally do that. Like I can't tell you if my comment will be groundbreaking, but
Well, it will be for us because we don't really know much about this skirt.
all right, I may call Melanie up because Melanie is a little bit better at later.
Historian, which is why we're really good friends.
Right. Yes, that's why she's talking. Is the archivist for the Clark County Museum is. So let me see. What are we looking at?
It's voluminous.
It is voluminous. Ooh.
And it has
Ooh.
both hand and machine sewing on it.
Ooh. Okay, Melanie, I'm definitely gonna get you to come up here and. So we're looking at a cool like, for the. That almost looks like it's been changed.
There's a lining in it, and there's a big chunk of the lining that someone deliberately cut out, not us.
Like it almost looks like it's altered.
Polished cotton on the inside.
Yeah.
So it's polished cotton on the inside.
I was thinking. That's interesting.
See, the silk is I think it's silk, but there's the blue part and then there's the floral part, but it's all woven of a piece.
Yeah.
So it's not two fabrics. No.
I have no idea what I'm looking at. I'm gonna hand it over to Melanie and see if she can come up with some cool.
Let's see. What's the shape look like?
And a really tiny waist.
So a lot of the clothing that you see, it's what's called survivor bias. Hold on, for my audience at home. For a lot of the skirts you see, it's called survivor bias. And I think this is where a lot of these rumors get started, especially about corsets, because they're all like 22, like waspy, like waists. The thing is that a lot of the clothes that get saved tend to be sentimental. So they tend to be wedding dresses. They tend to be dresses made during important parts of your life. The other thing is sheer practicality. If you are a larger woman and you die or you don't like the dress anymore, that is a lot of extra fabric that can be reused, cut down, changed into a different dress. If you only have a 22-inch waist, that's not going to give you much fabric. So it's going to really, you can save it because there's no point in cutting it up. There's no point in changing it into anything else because there's no fabric to change it. So you do end up with survivor biases of what types and styles of clothing get saved because of this. And it really does impact how we view fashion and how we see things. And it kind of goes back to what you were saying. I was showing you all high fashion. I made that choice deliberately, though, because I was just giving a basic overview. But so we have confliction. So for the audience at home, they may not come up with a solution. So while Melanie is looking, does anyone have any other questions? Any other comments?
I have a question about you said clothing slaves was such big business.
Mm-hmm.
What sort of fabric did they use? Was it a canvas type fabric?
So typically, especially if you're looking at field slaves, the most common type of fabric provided is something called Osnaburg, and you can still find it today. It is this just very cheap, thick, coarsely woven cloth. Like you can also make bags out of it. It's not high quality. It wears out very quickly. But it was the most popular if you look ledger after ledger after ledger specifically writes out Osnaburg fabric in large bulk quantities. I was actually, I can't remember who it was, but I was looking at some ledgers at the Clark County Museum from one of the plantation owners, and he regularly, there was large notations for Osnaburg fabric that he was purchasing.
And would they be sewn on the plantation?
Yes. So either, okay, so there were a few different things that could happen. Each region operates differently, each plantation operates differently, but kind of some of the general trends you see is slave clothing is some of the first mass-produced clothing because they're not worried about tailoring, they're not worried about fashion. So you can find, especially by the 1830s, these just cheap mass-produced, like almost like just t-shirts, and they would give it to everyone. It didn't really matter if you were male or female. You could also just give them fabric and they themselves would sew it, or, you know, the women would sew the clothes. Sometimes you would also see, especially like the very, very large setups, you would actually have like groups of women, and that would be their job, is to sew the clothes, and they would sew everything from, provided field hands, rations, to the lady of the house's clothes. And that's why you see things like I
know Jefferson had weavers.
Yes. So Jefferson had weavers. That was definitely by 1800. It was cheaper to import from England than it was to weave. I actually do, Melanie, remember what Thomas Jefferson was also, he had like a lot of like ideals why he had weaving.
He was really into the industry part. So he had weavers. He also had like nail manufactories on his plantation. He's not really the one you should use.
Right, like I respect Thomas Jefferson, and he did amazing things for this country. His plantation is a little weird because he's using it as kind of a test project. So he's doing some things to try to see if they're viable that you wouldn't see at other plantations.
Well, both he and Washington wanted their plantations to be self-sufficient.
Yeah. And Mount Vernon also has a weaving room. So, but if you look at this sale ad for 1805, one of the, she's being sold, and one of her selling points is that she's a good seamstress. And so that was actually a skill set, a high skill set that could be marketed. You have her, and then you have Elizabeth Keckley over here. She was the dressmaker for Mary Todd Lincoln. She had also been enslaved most of her life, but she was a seamstress. And so one of the things she made was all the household goods.
I was going to ask if that blue and white with the white piping was made.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was, and it was made by this woman. It's one of the few with good, strong, solid connections to both Mary Todd Lincoln and Keckley. Clothing is sometimes, especially trying to figure out who sewed it, it's almost impossible most of the time to figure out unless like there is some deep tragic story attached to it. A lot of times it's very difficult because there's not clothing tags. So you don't really have clothing tags indicating where things were made. Yes?
Now, are you familiar with the book A Midwife's Tale?
Yes.
So,
Ulrich Thatcher?
yeah, so the woman in that story, the midwife, she had daughters and daughters-in-law, and they produced, spun and wove at home, and had like a little cottage industry going there. But I think it was mostly for their own families.
Okay, so two things are going on with that. A Midwife's Tale, that is earlier. Late 1700s, because I think the woman who's doing the diary, A Midwife's Tale, which is the book she's asking about, is the diary of a midwife who served in New England for something like 50 odd years. Maine. Oh, that explains it. And so one, it's earlier time period. And that explains it. They're less, and that's why I was like, oh, that explains it. Maine is very cut off. Maine, you don't have access to a lot of trade goods. So you are gonna have to create a cottage industry. Otherwise, you're not gonna have any cloth to make any clothes. And so you see that, you don't see that as much as in the South, but you also have that in New England, where when they first come in, there's not much trade, there's not much industry. So they set up a cottage industry, they're spinning and weaving everything, and then they get trade set up, the fabric starts flowing in, and it turns into either a cottage industry where you're making things like blankets, or you just stop doing it. We got any insights?
They would have had to grow flax and have sheep.
Yes. Yeah, it's very labor intensive. Basically, ain't nobody got time for that. Like, if you can just go to the store and buy it, you're going to go to the store and buy it. Any thoughts, observations? Okay.
First, I want to know, does this have... Okay, I have thoughts. First, I want to know, does this have sentimental value to you? No. Okay.
My friend Sarah gave it to me.
Okay, cool.
It doesn't have sentimental value to either of us.
Perfect. I would have just tempered how I said this. It's synthetic. It's not old. So, and I'll come show you. Do you want to follow me and hold this? So I can show, so I can like talk and.
Was it made as a costume or something, do you
What
think?
I'm assuming, it's a really good reproduction.
Okay.
So the reason I think it's synthetic is because when you look really, really closely at the fibers, they are, so like natural fibers they don't fray. I mean, they do fray. You've got the little threads, but they don't they'll stay whole chunks, if that makes sense. You'll see the individual fiber. This is plastic, so when you look really, really closely, it's like really fuzzy, and it's not individual.
I got ripped off.
Which is why I'm like sitting up there squinting at it, because I'm trying to see kind of what it looks like.
Yeah.
Silk also, you can't get, this pattern is not historic. I would put it probably like, I don't know, maybe like 1940s through 1970s. I know it's a really wide time frame. But this is not a historic, it's woven, it's not printed. If you look super, super
it is
closely,
woven?
This is
it
woven.
is woven.
Wow.
I wish I had a magnifying glass.
This I can see is woven, but they're
Right. And this one, if you look really, really, really closely, you can see that each color is pixelated almost.
Yeah, I see that.
You can see that those are individual fibers, or individual threads doing it.
So you think it might have been made as a costume?
I think it's a really good reproduction. The other thing that clued me in is this hem is not a historic technique. So
Yeah, that is a weird hem.
it's close. They do a really good job getting close. It's you would use what's called hem tape.
Yeah.
It absorbs moisture. It's protective. Whatever.
That helps support the stitching.
Supports the stitching. This should be this wide,
Oh, if it was a
and
real-
it shouldn't
real-
just be tacked on and folded over,
Yeah.
because that's gonna fold down. It's gonna rip.
Another way you can tell synthetic from natural. Do this in a very, very safe. Yes, burn it. You can burn it. If it is natural, it will burn to ash. If it isn't, it'll just melt into plastic chunks. But I recommend that only if you're not sentimentally attached to it, and you can take like a small sample. So do we have any other questions? Yes.
I was just going to pick your brain, if I could, on additional reading material on women's fashion, the history of...
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we can do that after. How are we running on time? Good? Bad? Okay. We can discuss that afterwards. I can write down a few titles. Because it is a very wide range, and it really depends on
what you're looking for. Because, like, I just blasted through 100 years. And each year, or each 20 years, I could have done its own talk on. And it has its own bibliography attached. So we can discuss afterwards.
What about fashion magazines from 1800 through 1900?
So for the online viewers, she asked about fashion magazines from 1800 to 1900. So up until the 1840s, you do not actually see American fashion magazines.
Jane Austen writes about them.
Yes, she does, but Jane Austen is British. So the British do have it. One of the big ones when Jane Austen is alive is called Ackerman's. And they had fashion plates, they had stories, they had embroidery patterns. And women in the United States would get them shipped in. They would get shipped in both British and French. Depending on the time period, we go back and forth whether our allegiances lie with French fashion or British fashion. I'm not even going to touch that. But until 1840, there is not a homegrown American fashion magazine. It just does not exist. So the first real homegrown American fashion magazine that we see is Goody's Lady Book. And this is revolutionary from a couple of different standpoints. Sarah Hale, the editor, is one of the most important social figures in the United States for a good solid 20, 30 years. Goody's, this is the Cosmopolitan of the 1840s, and everyone read it. As the 19th century progressed, and you see this with print culture in general, starting in the 1840s and 50s, going back to our discussion of mass production, they figure out how to print books cheap. They figured out cheaper, easier ways to create everything from fabric to paper. And so starting in the 40s and 50s, you see an explosion of literary. If you think like Charles Dickens, you're talking weekly serials in newspapers. There's also a skyrocketing literacy rate. And so starting by 1870, there are quite a few competing fashion magazines vying. And some of them still exist, like Harper's Weekly. Actually, I think Cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan, yeah, it was an 1890s, like, fashion social magazine. They were very influential, but it was not just fashion, because these discussed politics. They talked about what was going on in society. They talked about the roles of women, and so they were very influential in women's lives. You could again whole talk on just that. But they definitely really take off in the 1880s, 1890s.
Did the aesthetic movement have much influence in the U.S.?
That's the 1840s, correct?
No, the 1870s, 80s, William Morris,
Ah,
not rational dress.
yeah. I don't really know that off the top of my head. Do you?
I don't think the answer is yes. I don't think it really impacted, because by that period we're going through our, like, that's end of Reconstruction.
Right.
Lots of stuff's going on here.
Right. I do know in the 1840s you do have the bloomer and the rational dress movement going on. Honestly, I don't know the answer, and that's what I'm gonna say.
That photo with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and what's her name? Susan B. Anthony. That's a late photo, right?
Yes.
They're elderly.
Yes.
But when their declaration came out,
Mhm.
did that have any impact except on the rational dress movement?
So really, the women's suffragette movement really does not take off until after the Civil War, and there's a few reasons for that. One of the big things is that suffragettes, the women's rights movement has a really deep tangled history in both the abolitionist movement, but also religious trends in the United States. And so you really don't see it take off until the 1880s, 1890s. And even then, there's a lot of people who are like, they'll get ideas, they'll start thinking this is just not a good idea. Right, very, very much so. And so it's a really sticky, tangled topic that I'm not quite sure how to give you a good answer for. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I know because these women tended to be more radical, they tended to be the more free thinkers. They did tend to follow, I'm going to call it the bohemian fashion, the hippie fashion. What I presented to you is the standard mainstream. There were always undercurrents. They were always the weird fashion trends. There was always the local. And so going back to like that bloomer trend in the 1840s, some of the major proponents were suffragettes, or they were kind of those more, they were moving around in the abolitionist circles. They were moving around in like the social movements. So, it's kind of chicken and the egg conversation as well. Like, are they radically dressing because of their politics, or, is it just like who they are and this is just something that appeals to them?
And then there's the hair in the 1830s.
Oh, I love that hair.
Did they support that with under?
Yeah, so there's actually like whole wiring set up. Like you can get buckram forms. So like, So, like the woman on the left, this woman, she's probably wearing either wigs, or she's probably wearing hair extensions, or she's wearing some sort of like bun support thing to get the bun as high as that is. I'm sure there's a technical proper term, but I don't know what it is. Things like this are actually just like buckram forms. Like, I don't know if have you ever done much with millinery and seen those wired ribbons? So they're using wired ribbons and stuff to get that form as well. There's also just like a lot of pomade, which is the equivalent of gel for our time period. Yeah, a lot of pomade. So we're talking wigs, we're talking hair extensions, we're talking buckram, we're talking a very, very, very skilled hairdresser. All have to be involved. Like,
And did it last the day after the ball?
So no. As a person who's running around in these curls, like sometimes you can't even keep the curls to stay the entire day, and then you just get like sad curls, or it's like completely straight and limp and you're just trying to like keep it to curl. Yeah, they're not the easiest hairstyles to keep together.
Really great for impromptu events.
Yes, absolutely. Like, oh my God, I'm just gonna go shopping tonight and just throw my hair up. Yeah. No thought whatsoever in these. Any? That is September Talk will cover.
So the first one is going to cover post-American Revolution, like that time, like early America. And the part 3 is going to, the modern American woman, 1900 to 1940.
So for the viewers at home, she asked when the September event is, and the first event is for clothing in the 18th century, and then the last one is going to be the 20th century, kind of the modern dress.
And do you think women will ever get to the point where we can go and try something on and it's standardized pretty much, or will I continue to have to go to a store and try on a petite size, a
I feel like you're living a dream, but we can all hope that the standardized sizing would work out. I actually have a whole rant about that, but like I'm not gonna go on it. If you want it afterwards, it's a little bit of a spicy take though, so I'm gonna cut myself off before I get myself into too much trouble. It's true. It's true.
Yeah, but I think that the pandemic has given us an excellent excuse to just be comfortable all the time.
Yes.
And there was an article, I think, in the Washington Post about the death of the underwire bra.
Yes. But I think that's an excellent example about how fashion does not exist in a vacuum. Fashion responds to what's going on around it. And if you're not leaving the house for 6 months, I'm not. All right, Denver and Nathan are the only ones, so I can say this. You're not going to wander around in a bra if you're 6 months and you're not leaving the house. And then once you do have to leave the house, you're going to be very sad. And so you're going to find alternatives. And you're going to figure out what your alternatives are. Right, exactly. So I apologize if I traumatized any males, but this is a reality we all live with. All right. All right, it looks like you guys have been an excellent audience. Thank you guys for coming out. If any of our online viewers have any questions or would have liked to comment on anything that was discussed tonight, feel free to email. Is there a good email? Do you have a good one?
Send it to either me, archives, or educator.
Okay, send your questions to archives or educator, and they'll kick me the question, and I'll get them answered. So thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. I hope you had a good time, and thank you for listening.
So thanks everybody for coming. Some events just, coming up. So Civil War Med will be coming up on April 9th. Material Culture of the African American Life in the Shenandoah Valley in May in the Miller School, as well as our Prohibition event in June. And also at CCHA, if you haven't seen on Facebook, we have a new exhibit. It's called It's Your War II. It's a companion exhibit to our program. So local women who served in World War II, if you want to see. We have uniforms. We even have a grenade pin that somebody gave one of our individuals. So we have all different items. So we're open from Tuesday to Saturday, 10 to 4 to view. And thank you for coming.